Let us discuss the issue of trans women in sport. We're going to be focused on Veronica Ivy's public lecture, including trans women athletes in sport. Veronica Ivy is a champion bicyclist. She used to go by the name Rachel McKinnon, which is important if you're trying to learn more about her work. You have seen the video already, so I don't need to repeat many things that are that she argued, but I will repeat some. I'm going to focus on two theses of hers, namely that sport is a human right and that endogenous testosterone limits on women in sport, which affect intersex people and trans women more, is an immorally discriminatory limit. Okay, so that's going to be our focus in this lecture. With regard to the premise that sport is a human right, Ivy avers to the International Olympic Committee's claim to that effect. That of course needs to be argued, but the IOC does claim that access to sport is a human right and that one should not be kept from participation in competitive sport on the basis of some unjust discrimination. But this raises the question of when is the discrimination unjust? So although we may want to say that everyone does have a right to compete in competitive sports, obviously we're not going to say that everyone has a right to compete in the Olympics, right? You have to go through, you have to qualify and so forth. Okay, so it's really not that you have a right to compete in any athletic event, but maybe there's just a general right to get to compete in some sort of athletic competitions. But which competitions is tough to say. Sometimes people can't compete in competitions in other countries or for other countries. So if there is, say, a European competition, I wouldn't be allowed to try out for that competition because I am not a European. Perhaps I can't compete, able-bodied people cannot compete in Special Olympics, right? So is the Special Olympics discriminating against able-bodied people, not to allow them to compete there? There was a case about, I don't know what, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe, where Oscar Pistorius, forget his name, who was a double amputee, wanted to compete, if I recall correctly, in the 400, maybe 800 meter races. Okay, but he had these running blades that some claimed gave him an unfair advantage. Okay, so there was dispute over that. I don't know if such equipment is allowed today, right? So is he allowed to compete again with able-bodied people? All right. If you think that maybe not, maybe that he has an unjust advantage or an unfair advantage with those blades, then you could see why it gets a little complicated to say that, well, everyone has a right to compete. Okay, but do they have a right to compete in any old league? And maybe not. Ivy talks about traditional ways of verifying sex. First, there was genital testing. They would just ask people to go into a room and examine your genitals to confirm that you were male or female. And then that got replaced with chromosome testing, but that was complicated by people with intersex conditions who maybe are XY, but still have female, more female-bodied phenotype. Okay, at least on the exterior, have sort of what appear to be female sexual organs. What can be done and is done is androgen testing, right? So just to see if there is the right amount of testosterone. If you have too much testosterone, you do not get to compete against women, and Ivy has a problem with that. So she also notes that for transgender women, they are in a bit of the current system sometimes puts them in a bit of a bind where they cannot compete with men or women. They cannot compete with women because sometimes their testosterone levels are too high, nor can they compete with the men because there's a rule that you have to, that your legal sex determines what your sex is. And so if they're legally women, then they can't compete against the men. They can't compete against the men even if they want to, under these rules. And so there's a bunch of barriers in place for trans women, even ones who want to compete against men. Things get philosophically interesting when Ivy starts talking about what is fairness in sports. So if we're going to ask whether or not it's unfair that trans women be allowed to compete against women or cisgendered women, we have to have some sort of general guide or some general principle for what makes sport fair. And if the standard is that you're not breaking any rules, then trans women in sport is fair. All the sport has to do is say that they get to compete, and they have to follow the same rules as everyone else. And if that's the case, then trans women could be it could be fair for trans women to compete tomorrow, as long as they're allowed to play or to compete. If it is unfair that trans women compete in sport because they have an advantage over cisgendered women, then this raises the question of whether or not that's because fairness is basically the view that everyone has an equal chance of winning. This would seem to be an absurd moral standard for fairness, because that would mean we should just essentially decide who wins races and so forth with coin flips. So we don't really want fairness in sport to be that everyone has an equal chance of winning. We want training to matter. We want smarter training to matter, and that is to say, to give you an advantage. We want more talented people to win. All other things being equal, we like the idea that talent is revealed by competition. Okay, so all those things give people, though, advantages, and so we really don't think that sport requires that everyone have an equal chance of winning. A third philosophy of sport fairness would be sort of contractarian in nature and say that, well, if you have a bunch of people who agree to a bunch of rules, then any competition, any competitors that obey those rules are playing fairly. Any competition where the players adhere to those rules is a fair competition. And well, that's fine, but that also would allow trans athletes, if the participants just decided to include them. So it isn't as if that is some sort of natural barrier to inclusion of trans athletes. But even more problematically, perhaps, is that it clearly would allow the exclusion of trans athletes if the sporting body or the players who just decided to get together to play decided for no good reason to exclude trans people. And one way to appreciate the bite of this objection is to say, well, suppose that a league just let white people play. Okay, and so that would be the consensual participation agreed to by all the players, right? Because those players just decide for whatever reason to allow only whites to play. So that standard would exclude people on the basis of race, and a lot of people think like that would be immoral. Now, we do have exclusionary leagues all the time. For instance, there are church leagues. If a bunch of Lutherans get together and have a little Lutheran league, basketball league or something like that, and they exclude Catholics and they exclude Muslims and they exclude Baptists and so forth, would that be unfair? I don't know what to say. You may think that's unproblematic, okay, but we have to think about whether or not there are any is there anything about church leagues that they could get away with it, whereas sort of professional leagues don't? We also have college leagues that discriminate. So you can't play in college football if you're not in college. And if you're on an intramural team, you can't play on the team unless you're enrolled at the school. Okay, so all of those exclude people. And, is it unfair that they exclude people in that way? You might think not, right? But, it needs to be, we need to figure out what is it about those cases where that's okay, but it's not okay to exclude people on the basis of, say, their race, or their being transgender, or their being the opposite sex or gender, right? So one thing looming in the background here that you need to be keeping in mind in this whole discussion is what justifies having male and female leagues. For her part, Ivy prefers a Rawlsian approach to fairness in sport, which uses the Rawlsian method of thinking about fairness in terms of what you would accept behind a veil of ignorance, or veil of ignorance reasoning. So what sort of policies would we choose behind a veil of ignorance? So if you didn't know you're a man or a woman, what would you want the rules to be in sport? Would you want male-only sports if you didn't know whether you were going to be a man or a woman once you stepped out from behind the veil of ignorance? Well, you might not. You'd say, well, look, I don't know if I'm a woman behind the veil of ignorance, and I would like to play sport in this society. So I'm going to be against a policy in that society that says women can't play sport because I may be a woman, right? Likewise, behind a veil of ignorance, you might be against racial discrimination in sport because you'd say, well, I don't know what race I am behind the veil of ignorance. And once I would hate to be excluded from sport on the basis of my race. So I'm going to advocate then behind the veil of ignorance for a policy that would not exclude people on the basis of race. And she thinks that you would also say behind a veil of ignorance, well, I don't know if I'm transgender, right? So if I want to have the right to play sport, if I'm transgender, then I am going to be against a policy that discriminates against transgender people playing sport. Now, I don't know whether or not veil of ignorance reasoning really does support that conclusion. It seems possible to me that I would say to myself, well, behind the veil of ignorance, I don't know if I'm going to be a woman. And if I'm a cisgendered woman, I am not going to want transgender women as competitors. I could certainly imagine a cisgendered woman athlete saying that because many do. So if I'm thinking behind veil of ignorance reasoning, I may actually reason that it'd be better to have a policy excluding trans women from women's sport on the chance that I'm a woman. One weird thing about veil of ignorance reasoning is whether or not you should care about the probabilities of any of this. So if the probability is very low that you're going to be a transgender woman, but the probability is quite high that you're going to be a cisgendered woman, then from that perspective, it might actually be much more reasonable to, behind a veil of ignorance, to choose a policy that would exclude trans women from women's sport. Ivy spends some time in her discussion talking about the performance advantages, or the supposed performance advantages, that testosterone imbues upon athletes that have it. And to sum up, she thinks the advantages are somewhat overblown. Okay, so perhaps there is some advantage, but there's not nearly the dramatic advantage that a lot of people claim come with a higher testosterone rate. The more important point here, though, is that even if having a higher testosterone having higher testosterone levels is a performance advantage. It is one performance advantage among many. So for instance, being tall, having a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers if you're a sprinter, or a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers if you're a long distance runner, having the right sort of body frame, right? Having a sort of thick bones if you're a weight lifter, and thin bones if you're a long distance runner, etc. All of these things give you massive advantages, okay? So even if testosterone gives you a significant or even massive advantage, I'm going a little bit further than perhaps what she says, but I think this is accurate to what she says. Even if testosterone gives you a very significant advantage indeed, higher testosterone rates give you a very significant advantage indeed, even if that's the case, well, then it's just one of the many advantages that athletes have. So why, among all the different advantages that athletes can have, why should this advantage be picked out as an unfair advantage? Why should women with higher testosterone, say because they're trans, be excluded because of this advantage when cisgendered women with other massive advantages are not barred from competition? In fact, why would a cisgendered woman who has all the same advantages of a transgendered woman be allowed to compete when a transgender woman wouldn't? So this is discriminatory. Look, discrimination happens, okay, and it could be some discrimination is perfectly okay. Again, you may think it's discriminatory. It's a morally acceptable form of discrimination to keep able-bodied people out of the Special Olympics or out of the Paralympics, and to keep people up with no sort of mental or intellectual disabilities out of the Special Olympics. That's a set-aside place for people in the Special Olympics. And you may say, look, that's perfectly fair. Okay, so some discrimination is fair, you probably think. It isn't. The problem isn't that it's not that it's discriminatory, but that it is arbitrarily discriminatory, that there's no good reason. Unlike the Paralympics case or the Special Olympics case, there is no morally probative reason for discriminating against people with higher testosterone rates. That's the argument. So as I said, Ivy feels that the performance advantages provided by testosterone are overblown. She argues that it's not quite the testosterone that matters, but the sensitivity to the testosterone that's more crucial, although she still thinks it's a mistake to assume that there's a good correlation between testosterone and athletic performance. I don't know. I am not a scientist. I won't comment on how accurate Ivy's claims are here. I think a lot matters. I think how much testosterone you have during development matters a lot. And that, so if you grow up with testosterone, you get a host of advantages on a lot of different variables. It's not just, testosterone, it's muscle, it's shoulder width, it's, leverage, it's a bunch of different things that could actually advantage you and advantage you long after your testosterone rates decline. I don't really buy the 10% performance advantage that Ivy claims testosterone might provide at the high end. We have all this evidence that, there's all these reports of how the World Cup winning women's soccer team practices and loses regularly to high school boy soccer teams, right? So that's more than a 10% advantage. I don't know what's going on there, right? But that doesn't really matter what the advantages are. They could be tremendously huge, but her argument still stands. And I'm going to represent her general strategy in a sort of highly abstract philosophical dialogue okay, and I'm going to use Middle Earth character names to keep track of these different approaches. And what I'm going to do in this part of the lecture is give you some routes for attacking this Ivy's position about the morality or the fairness of trans women in sport. Ivy's basic argument is going to look something like this. Let's just call it the basic argument, and we'll have Frodo being the defender of trans women in sport. And so that argument goes as, so trans women are women, premise one. Ceteris paribus, as I say, except for weird conditions like, you're in jail for murder or you're on death row or something like that, it's immoral to keep women from competing in women's sport. Okay, so Ivy holds that premise. Premise three, there is no ceteris paribus condition that justifies excluding trans women from women's sport. That is to say, it isn't like, oh, well, Jill's on death row and that's why she's not allowed to compete. Keeping trans women out of women's sport isn't justified by any sort of sensible exception like that. So then it follows logically that it is thus immoral to keep trans women from competing in women's sport. Okay, so that's the starting argument. It's going to have to get a lot more complicated as we see, because an objection can be made to premise one. Let's say Pippin. The Pippin strategy, let's call this the Pippin strategy. The Pippin strategy is going to object to premise one, that trans women are women. Okay? So obviously the critic of trans women in sport will have to deny one of Basic's three premises. And the first shot will be just objecting to premise one, to say that trans women are not women. I'm not going to pursue that strategy here. I'm just going to, obviously it is a way you could go. There have been recent arguments to that effect published in philosophy, arguing that, well, literally speaking, trans women are not women, and you might want to base an argument on that. That's one way to go. So the Pippin strategy goes as so: trans women are not women. If that's right, then premise one of the basic argument is false. And if premise one is false, then the basic argument is unsound. So the basic argument is unsound. All right. So this would lead us down a lot of complexities about the nature of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. Is it what you just want to be? Must you have a certain psychology to be a woman or a man? Do trans women have that psychology, and so forth? It's fine to talk about in class discussion or something like that, but I want to look at a different strategy. And this is going to be a strategy that will associate with Sam. And I think this is a pretty common strategy against the basic argument. Let's call this Sam strategy the unfair advantage objection. So the unfair advantage objection goes as so: male-bodied men have advantages that justify barring them from women's sports. It's these advantages, whatever it is, like more muscle or thicker bones or more explosive power or whatever. I don't know what it is. But they have these advantages, okay? And it's these advantages, and not their being male as such. It's these advantages that justify keeping them from women's sports. Why is that crucial? Because trans women have, or have to a sufficient degree, those same advantages. Those more explosive muscles, that higher testosterone, that bigger frame or height or whatever. That's why it's key to say it's not that they're male, or it's not even their being man or male that keeps them from women's sports. It's these advantages. And since trans women have these advantages, okay, premise three of the basic argument is false. There is a ceteris paribus condition that justifies excluding trans women from women's sport. Okay. All right. So to this, Frodo can reply with the arbitrariness point that Ivy brought up earlier. Okay. Men are not barred from women's sport because of these advantages. A cis woman with these same advantages wouldn't be barred from women's sport. So imagine that Jill had all the same advantages that you say advantage males over females. Okay, so she has the big frame, the explosive muscles, the whatever. Okay, let's say she even has the same testosterone or whatever. So let's say, you know, she has all those same advantages as Jack, such that you want to keep Jack from competing in women's sport. She would still get to play. So it isn't the case that we're keeping males from women's sport because of the advantages they have, because a woman with those same advantages would get to play. So barring trans, but not cis women with these advantages, then is morally arbitrary, right? You would let Jill with all those male-bodied advantages compete. You wouldn't let transgender Jane compete. So it's just morally arbitrary. It's not even because of those advantages at all. It's that you don't want trans people in. And then, you know, just to clean up the argument, a policy based upon an arbitrary difference is immoral or morally unfair or something like that. And so barring trans women from women's sport is wrong. All right. So you're keeping track, I think, of how Sam's strategy to talk, Sam's about unfair advantages, okay? And Frodo has made a rebuttal. You may be persuaded by the rebuttal, you may not, but Frodo does have something to say about Sam's argument. Okay, now Sam could reply, and let's imagine his reply. He would say, okay, let me retrench. How athletes get these advantages matters for some reason. Hence the difference in treatment between steroid users and natural athletes. Now that's true, right? So compare natural Jack with doping Jake. Natural Jack could have all the same muscles and, you know, power as doping Jake has, but Jack would get to play. So it isn't that sport keeps out people with massive muscles and so forth, right? It's not that any of us want to keep people like that out. We don't want to keep people with steroid-like bodies out. We want to keep people who got their bodies from steroids out or got their bodies with the help of steroids out. So we care about the source of those advantages. That's the only reason that we could possibly give for justifying, at least, and the only fair, I mean, there may be health reasons to keep out people who take steroids. But if it's a fairness rationale, it has to be because we think using steroids is the wrong way to get that power. That we're okay with you having that power, but if you're so blessed genetically to have it. All right, so if you get that premise, then move on to premise 18. A trans woman's having the advantage of a male has the advantage of a male athlete because she is male, or was male. If you want to say that when you change your gender, you also change your sex. So a trans woman's male-like advantages comes the wrong way. It comes from actually being male or having been male. And if that's right, then it follows that 14 is false. It isn't morally arbitrary. We've given a non-arbitrary explanation why we would keep out a transgender woman with advantages X and not a cisgendered woman with those same advantages X out. And then it wouldn't be arbitrary. Why? Because they came about advantage X in different ways, and the transgender woman came about advantage with those advantages, whatever they are, the wrong way by being male-bodied naturally. Now let's look at a third strategy for attacking Frodo's basic argument, or Veronica Ivy's basic argument. And we'll put this in the mouth of Farmer Maggot. And it's a reductio against women's sport. It goes as so. This is where we get the tension with having gendered sport in the first place. Farmer Maggot begins by saying, look, Frodo, your basic argument plus the arbitrariness argument you just gave would seem committed to saying that any woman with any advantage A, let's say being tall or having a lot of muscle or something like that, should be accepted into women's sport. But if that's true, then men and women's sport shouldn't be segregated just because men have certain advantages, right? So why separate men and women at all in sport on a day-to-day basis, right? If Frodo's basic argument plus his arbitrariness point hold, then, you know, if any man you could think of, okay, LeBron James, if his female doppelganger, Jill James, if Jill James had the same body as LeBron James, Jill James would get to play in the WNBA, right? She'd just be a woman with LeBron James capabilities. And nobody would say that she doesn't get to play. So if we would allow Jill James to play in the WNBA, what gives us the right to discriminate against cis LeBron James, her twin brother? What gives us the right to keep LeBron James out of the NBA, other than this arbitrary discrimination against him because he's male and he identifies as a man? The basic argument plus the arbitrariness point entails that gender segregated sports are unjustified on Frodo's own reasoning, on Ivy's own reasoning, Farmer Maggot would say. But Farmer Maggot goes on, but come on, gender segregated sports are justified. He is using this as a reductio of Ivy's view and says, look, if your view is right, then we can't justify even having women's sports at all. We can't justify having men's sports at all. We would not have a men's and women's Cougar team. We would just have the Cougar basketball team and so forth. And that's something has gone wrong, because obviously we should be able to have a women's team. So somewhere along the line, Frodo's argument goes wrong. Now, Frodo may respond to Farmer Maggot. Frodo may go as so. Maggot, your premise 21, which says, if that's true, then men and women's sports shouldn't be segregated just because men have certain advantages, assuming they do. Frodo would say, Farmer Maggot, that premise assumes that gender segregation must be justified by physical differences between men and women, right? This whole LeBron James, Jill James thing, the reason we separate men and women in sport is because of physical advantages or something like that men have, or physical differences that men and women have, but maybe not. But gender segregation, Frodo may say, now I'm not putting this in Ivy's mouth, but I will put this in Frodo's mouth because it's the way he could answer. Frodo could say, but gender segregation isn't justified by any sort of performance differences between men and women. It's justified by some sort of social differences, or some sort of social aim that justifies keeping men and women apart. Let me give you just a crazy sort of story about why that might be. Suppose that there were no physical differences between men and women, no interesting athletic differences between men and women, but men kept groping women on the basketball court. So like, they're just going for a fast break and the guys just like, grab the women's breasts on the team. And they're just constantly just groping the women on the team because, they're little sex fiends or whatever. Okay. You might say, well, look, someone may say, look, we should segregate. We should segregate the men and the women. There's no performance differences in my little thought experiment, right? We're going to segregate them. Why? Because the men are pests when the women are around. So we need just a separate league for women so they could play basketball without being constantly groped every time they go up for a rebound. Okay. So that would be a social reason, not any sort of reason having to do with physical performance differences for segregated sports. Now, something like that, as far-fetched as that sounds, something like that may actually be a reason. I don't know. I haven't done a lot of, digging into the history of sex segregation in sports. But something like that may have been a big rationale for having sex segregation in sports. I don't think that people in the 1930s or 40s or whenever they started letting women play basketball in some sort of, school leagues or something like that. I don't think they would have, the fact that men were more athletic or whatever when it came to basketball probably was not nearly as important as the fact that they didn't want men and women all sweaty bumping up against each other all the time. Okay, it wasn't, something like that was against the norms of propriety, sexual propriety. What if men just insulted women a lot and didn't grope them, but just were mean? Or what if men just trash talked a lot and women didn't like trash talk, and they just, can we just have a league where we don't just trash talk all the time? All this trash talk, just bringing a bad energy. I wish I could play in a way that, in a place where I didn't have that sort of trash talk around all the time. Well, that might be a social rationale for separating men and women, right? Just trash talk. And if that's right, then premise 21 of Farmer Maggot's reductio is false, and so his argument's unsound. Okay, now Maggot can respond to this in a very interesting way. That says that if Frodo goes this route, that Frodo would thus hoist himself by his own petards, that he would be contradicting his earlier argument. And he would argue, so if social concerns could justify gender segregation, like say that, society just wants to separate men and women because of something annoying about men or something annoying about women or some incompatibility between how the two behave or something like that, that makes it socially desirable to have two separate leagues. If it's about that, not about performance, then those same similar types of social concerns could justify excluding trans women, right? So once you put it into society's hands to say who gets to play or not, then all the old worries resurface, right? Which is that, oh, well, then you could exclude Black people for any of those reasons. You could exclude, trans women for those reasons, because just society doesn't want to see it, or we want a separate place for cis women for social reasons, or to help counterbalance some sort of discrimination they face or something like that. And because of that, we just want cis women there. And you can't really criticize that because you've already accepted that a rationale for gender segregation can be based upon some sort of social concern or some sort of social goal. Now, of course, the debate doesn't need to end there. It's not like it's a fatal point that Maggot has scored. Frodo could absolutely come back with saying that, okay, well, there are social justifications for segregation that are morally acceptable, and there are social justifications for sex segregation that are not morally acceptable, and the ones that keep out trans are not morally acceptable, but the ones that allow separating men and women are acceptable. And then Frodo would have to expand upon that and justify that as a real thing. So I encourage you, maybe for your paper, to explore how Frodo could respond to Maggot's dilemma of either including or excluding trans women or destroying gender discrimination in sport. How might the debate between Sam and Frodo go on the question of the sourcehood for advantage? And how might a debate, which we don't really need to explore here in this class because that's more of a metaphysics thing than an ethics thing, but how might a debate that questions Frodo's original claim that trans women are women proceed? That is obviously the third strategy. So you have the Pippin strategy, trans women aren't women. You have the Sam strategy that is based upon unfairness and getting some sort of performance advantage in the wrong way. And then you have the Farmer Maggot's strategy, which is to argue that Frodo is ultimately going to be unable to justify sex/gender segregation in sports if Frodo is going to grant that trans women have a right to compete against women on the basis of the basic argument and the arbitrariness point.